Hi, folks. My name's Maud Mosley. My pronouns are they, them, and today I am joined by Eliot for a one-off interview about social dysphoria because we both agreed that it would be really cool for everyone to learn more about this topic and understand it a little bit better from a personal side. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, Eliot, before we start?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, my name's Elliot. I use the pronouns they and them. On the internet, you can find me as Gender Bandit. So on Twitter, I'm just Gender Bandit. But on Instagram, because unfortunately someone else had that genius idea as well as I did, it's gender_bandit. I'm also the education coordinator for a charity based in Ottawa called the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity. And I have some experience doing training for healthcare professionals around how to take care of 2S LGBTQ folks, in addition to just being super queer. So that's kind of my 2 cents on who I am, and I've known you for a couple of years now, and I'm really excited to be on your channel and like speaking to people and sharing some of the cool conversations that we have.
Absolutely. I'm so thankful to have you and your experience here. I know it's going to be so helpful to adding to this ongoing conversation that we've been having, on this channel. So I want to know, I've explained it in a previous video. I've brought it up multiple times, but how would you explain social dysphoria?
I would describe social dysphoria as the distance between how I see myself and how other people perceive me. So one of the things that's really hard about social dysphoria is that it doesn't really have anything to do with how you as a person feel about yourself, because it's entirely dependent on how other people perceive you, which you have very little, if any, control over.
Yeah, and that's a great way to put it, and it's an unfortunate reality about the situation. So with that in mind, how does social dysphoria show up for you personally?
Oh my goodness, it really does come up daily. I think you've talked about on your channel about like other kinds of dysphoria, about like the sort of traditional gender dysphoria or like physical dysphoria, body dysphoria. I think there's a really common misconception, both inside and outside of the community, that after trans people undertake physical transition, if that's something that's important to them, dysphoria is over forever. And one of the hardest things about getting top surgery for me personally was the understanding that this was not going to change how other people perceive me, right? Because it was like, I just understood that that was not going to be a thing. That was not going to be a barometer that I could really use to determine how other people were going to perceive me. And so in some, that was something that doctors said to me, and something that I then had to go forward and say to doctors and sort of be like, you need to talk to people about how, unfortunately, social dysphoria is kind of a permanent thing. Like social dysphoria isn't going to be alleviated until we actually really take apart like societal expectations for gender, which is something that is never going to be accomplished in one single person's lifetime, right? So it's so pervasive, it's so hard to avoid it. And the example that I always give to people is that I often experience social dysphoria when I'm getting coffee, because I really like expensive coffee, because like every millennial, I was a barista for a very long time, and it made me kind of a dork for good espresso and that kind of thing. So, and it helps me to get out of the house, especially with like anxiety issues that I have, and just like the pandemic in general, although not so much right now, because obviously it's not polite to go get coffee that you don't need when you could unintentionally infect someone with a, pandemic situation. Anyway, so a really, really common example for me of social dysphoria showing up is when I order coffee from, Starbucks or whatever coffee place I'm going into. And even when it's a coffee shop that asks me for my name, so even when I'm able to say to them, this is for Elliot, can you put the name Elliot on the cup, which is a name that I intentionally chose because it's not obviously feminine. And then at the end of the interaction, the barista still says, okay, miss, have a nice day. And I'm like, oh, because I felt so good up until right there. And then it's like, I really do feel like there's this moment of sort of being outside of yourself where you realize that how you understand yourself and how you think you're presenting yourself is meeting this wall of how the other person understands you. And to me, it really is very jarring. It really is an experience that sort of takes me out of my body for a minute and sort of like, oh, other people don't see me the way that I see me. And that's a really hard thing to understand and to, sort of make a response to how you understand yourself and how you live your life. And so even though I have done a lot of the things that I would consider important to me for my physical transition, I don't think there's other aspects of my transition that I'm going to be pursuing. I don't think that I will ever stop experiencing social dysphoria. And that's something I've had to kind of make my peace with. And there are days where, I'll say to my partner, I said I was going to do these errands, but I can't do it today because I'm too in my head about feeling that I'm going to go into Shoppers Drug Mart and I'm going to have to deal with the knowledge that people who are only looking at me for like 3 seconds are perceiving me as a woman, and that makes me upset.
Absolutely.
That was a very long answer to how social dysphoria shows up for me, but it's a big topic.
It's so big and it's so fantastic because I think something that you kind of touched on, or at least how I perceive, what you were talking about, is especially as non-binary individuals, because in our society, we're always put into boxes. You can be a man or you can be a woman. So non-binary people, whether they pursue any kind of transitioning or not, likely they're always going to feel a social dysphoria around being put in one of those boxes. And they could start being put in a different box, but they're still not being seen correctly.
Yeah.
And I think
it's
that's
still the wrong box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting aspect of it. And, really does touch on that idea of, for people that are experiencing social dysphoria for those reasons, it really is not going to stop until we, all start breaking down how we see gender in our head and how we perceive others. For sure. And so you talked about a lot of day-to-day life there. So I'm not going to ask for more about that, but you did, mention a discussion with your partner. So I was just wondering if you wanted to touch on how social dysphoria may impact relationships you have. And that could be either, partner, it can be friendships, it can be working relationships.
Yeah, I really do think social dysphoria has played a pretty significant role in why I am even an activist, why I do the work that I do, because. And I don't want to make it sound like I don't love the work that I do, or I don't, I really do feel very privileged that, people take me seriously and that my job gets to be telling people stories about my life and having that be what I give to the world. Like, that really does mean a lot to me. But I think there's also a really big counterbalance to that, which is I don't know if I would have been successful in any other career because I constantly would have been explaining this stuff anyway. Maud, you and I have talked about how, as people who work in education, as people who work in activism, we're constantly explaining to people the very basics of, okay, trans people exist. No, really, we exist. I'm going to wait while you process that, but we exist. And, a lot of explaining and, going over what are pronouns and how do people use pronouns. And again, I do really love doing that education, but there was definitely a moment in my life where I sort of had to say to myself, listen, you're going to be doing this all day, every day anyway. So you might as well make it your job. So there's like there's a very serious connection in terms of my day-to-day life and my day-to-day relationships, because I was going to have to do this education, even if I had desperately wanted to be like an accountant or something. I don't know why I picked accountant, because I'm terrible at math. I would be the worst accountant, really. But even if I had stayed in academia, even if I had stayed as a barista, like, that was something I constantly had to deal with, was sort of explaining to my coworkers, explaining to my partner, this is how I perceive myself. This is who I am. And I find, it has impacted social plans with people before too. Like, I can't say for sure if this has ever happened to you, but I think it's a very trans feel that sometimes, and this is again one of those things where we're going to pretend the pandemic's not a factor for a minute, but it's like, you were going to have social plans, you were going to go do something, and then you have to call a friend and be like, So I'm having a panic attack about whether or not I can wear pants, and I cannot meet you today. Like, I'm really sorry. This is not happening. I am coming undone over earrings, and that's what I need to do today. So yeah, like I think it really does have an enormous impact. Both for me, it has an enormous impact professionally, personally, and something that I think is kind of interesting is it actually has almost secondary impacts on some of the people that I care about. So my partner is a cis man, and prior to getting in a relationship with me, he had never been in a relationship with someone who didn't identify as a woman. And so my social dysphoria actually influences how people feel about him, because you know, a lot of people where he works have never met me, they've never seen me, so he just talks about you know, my partner Eliot, and he works with a lot of like middle-aged engineers who I think interpret that as, okay, you know, my male partner who is at home, who is named Eliot, who is a man, because that's like how they conceive of the world. And even sometimes like the knowledge that other people are thinking about me that way is something that kind of twigs me out. Like, it's something that I have to sort of sit with and be like, it doesn't matter what people at his job think. Like, it has, you know, they don't know that you're an educator. They don't know, they don't care. Like, they just think you're this hypothetical person who chose to marry an engineer. Like, who does that? But it's, I don't know, it really does feel like it has such an enormous impact on my relationships and even the relationships of people who care about me. Like, it's such a huge factor.
Absolutely. And I love, hearing the parts you brought up about those working relationships and how, you got pushed into these fields for that reason, because that's something I'm actually looking forward to talking about in the future. I have stuff planned. If you would like to hear more about, how people with certain experiences are pushed into doing this work because they really feel like they have no other option, please keep your eyes open for that, because those are conversations we need to be having. But also when it comes to relationships, yes, like I can relate so much, but then also looking at that secondary notion that a lot of people don't look at is, how does our social dysphoria pass on through people? How do we become, like, how do we see these networks as they actually are? Because a lot of people don't see that, particularly, like cis people who haven't experienced social dysphoria potentially. They see it as this little bubble around yourself. They see it, very something internal that really only impacts you, instead of, you seeing this whole network. And when you're talking about like getting a panic attack or feeling that stress or getting so overwhelmed that you can't leave the house, that does seem, ridiculous when it's just happening in yourself, even though that's definitely not ridiculous if it even was just yourself. But they're also just not seeing that spider web that is creating that overwhelming feeling, that panic and anxiety can lead to. So with that in mind, I just mentioned, cis people who don't experience social dysphoria. And is there something you wish they knew about it?
Yeah, my favorite thing to say to medical professionals when I was training and I would be defining the concepts of different kinds of dysphoria, I always explain social dysphoria as, it's not me, it's you. Like, it's actually your problem, it's your fault. Like, I feel bad and I feel uncomfortable because of expectations that you have of the person that I am, based on things like, how I'm dressed, or the tone of my voice, or the way I'm expressing myself. And it's so frustrating because that's one of the things that is just really absolutely never going to be within my control. And I think it's frustrating for a lot of trans people. I think it must be especially frustrating for trans women in particular, because we feel pressure because of social dysphoria to conform to particular expectations of masculinity and femininity that we may never have wanted to ascribe to in the first place, right? Like, we don't question, or we don't question to the same extent cis women who dress masculinely or who have short hair or want to express themselves in whatever way. But I find there's a very particular expectation of behavior for trans women, that they're going to want to have long hair and wear dresses all the time and wear makeup and learn how to do their nails and all this highly impractical stuff that, you know, I never got the hang of when I was younger and thought that I was supposed to learn to do that as a girl. And it's so frustrating because even if you're the master of all of those things, it doesn't matter because it's not about you, right? It's about what other people perceive. So I think if I was going to say there's one thing I wish people outside the community understood about dysphoria is that that's on you. Y'all should work on that because it's not a problem that I can fix or that any you know, single person or even the trans community as a whole. I think it's not something that we can change because it really is fundamentally based on the gap between my self-perception and what society has trained you to believe about people based on cues that you interpret in less than a second without thinking about it.
Yeah. And that is definitely so true. And I love that you're bringing that up because it shows, you know, one of the big reasons why having these conversations publicly is so important is, you know, we should learn about this as a community. And every time I talk about social dysphoria, you know, I'm able to connect with somebody who goes, that's the language I needed. That's what I was feeling. I didn't understand. And I am so thankful for that. But that's also why these conversations need to go way past the community. So we can really be like, this is not our responsibility. This is the impact it's having on us, but it is not our responsibility, and really shifting that perspective onto other people so that we can really start moving towards, you know, solutions in a world where this doesn't have such a great impact on people. And then speaking of that impact that it has on people, you know, moving this conversation away from people who don't experience social dysphoria, what have you found works for you personally when it comes to combating social dysphoria? And do you have any tips that you can share with others going through similar experiences?
This is such a hard like thing to have specific advice for because I think everyone's understanding of who they are and what rocking it looks like personally is so different. Personally, I find that the best thing that I can do in terms of social dysphoria is I like to think of myself in terms of how I'm encouraging other people, because something that I find very powerful is the knowledge that living your truth gives other people the freedom to live their truth. And so it's sort of like I trick my brain into thinking, you know, there's somebody out there who really needed to see you with your funny hair and your jean jacket with all the patches or your aggressive political t-shirt. Somebody needed to see that today. And to me, I'm willing to make sort of that trade-off of other people might not get it, but that's okay because you're not here for them. Because I don't think there's any sort of realistic, or to me, there has never been a realistic path forward where social dysphoria isn't going to happen. So the way that I combat social dysphoria is by focusing on the things that make it worth it, that make it, you know, it's okay for me to experience this because I'm going to get fancy coffee at the end of it, or it's okay that I'm going to experience this because, you know, there's a little kid out there who needed to see somebody like me just living their truth and being authentic. And whether or not that person is trans, you know, just seeing someone who is unapologetically wearing, you know, a Black Lives Matter t-shirt or whatever it is that people are, you know, whatever it is that you're doing to express yourself and how that might relate to your gender, that feels very powerful to me to think about how that might be helping somebody else. I mean, ideally, I would get to a place of self-actualization where I just wouldn't care what other people think. But in the interim, I find tricking my brain this way is very helpful.
Amazing. Yeah. And I think that's such an important thing for other people, you know, to hear. And thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a fantastic conversation. I am so glad you made the time for this. If you would like to find any of Eliot's work, you can check out any of the links below this video. I highly recommend you do so. And thank you for watching. Also, let me know if you would like more one-off interviews with people in the future. I would love to make them happen. Bye, folks.